Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV, and for my members, SFO Continuity. Today, we're going to go around the world with iconic Family Office counselor extraordinaire. And who would that be? It could kind of only be one person. Today, our special guest features a longtime friend and acquaintance, Joseph A. Field of Counsel, Holland and Knight. Before I more formally introduce or welcome Joe to the show, I'm really excited to announce this conversation with a true legend in the global family office community for over 40 years. Joe has been a towering figure, consulting to the world's most prominent families of wealth, management, tax mitigation, and international structuring. And I'm so fortunate that after knowing Joe for about 20 years, finally, after all these years, we're going to have a wonderful family office-centric conversation. I'm very honored from someone I consider a friend, and I wish even more so, but he's very busy, but the 20 or 30 times over the decades a mentor. Joe, welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Well, Angelo, I'm going to leave a small deposit for you for that very overgenerous introduction. I'm really pleased to do this, and I would love nothing better than spend a little more time with you.
Well, whatever little time we have, I want to make it as valuable as possible to our audience. Given that you've been in the community for decades, given that you literally have lived around the world and have worked with families legitimately on multiple continents, why don't I start with, what are some of the biggest changes in the world of wealth, billionaires, and family offices that you've seen over more than 4 decades?
Well, I think the whole family office concept has been really legitimized over the last period of time. This was a very well-kept secret by the Rockefellers and the Bessemer Trust family and maybe 20 or 30 others. But sometime around 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, it became a sort of hot topic. And it was a hot topic without a definition. And it still has a very limited definition, but today, a lot more families are getting actively involved in this concept. They are looking to provide wealth down through generations, and perhaps more importantly, devise charitable plans that are of use to the whole world. And I think one of the things that I have noticed in the last several years is that wealth has become a target. And a lot of people are out to get rid of wealthy families, either by taxation or by means of changing rules and laws. And I think the wealthy families need to do something to show that they are serious participants in society. And the mere fact that they have money simply gives them an opportunity to do more for society than the rest of us can do.
Well, that's very good points, and you're correct. Since I got in the industry about 20 years ago, the number of people that are now familiar with the broad vernacular family office, specifically single family office, is much, much greater than ever. However, like you said, the bifurcation of the haves and have-nots and the challenges of the so-called billionaire and the families being effectively a target on their back. Yes, taxation is a form of wealth compensation, poor government, monetary policy, inflation, and like you said, changing the goalpost and the guidelines relative to regulatory issues are all grave challenges. However, families do owe it for their fortunate opportunity to give back and be beneficial to society and the community as well. Joe, what would you say are some of the differences among the super rich globally when you have lived and traveled in the Middle East, in Asia, in the Caribbean, in North America broadly, and in Europe, and maybe more so now than in the past? Are there obviously cultural, but what other differences as well? One I would give in Asia, there almost appears to be, unlike other parts of the country with what you just said, a respect for being an entrepreneur, of making a lot of money. They're almost the athlete, the superhero, the person who struck out and became wealthy is honored and revered.
Well, I think there's some truth to that, but I would view that as something of a mitigating factor. And I think wealth is admired in Asia, but I think you see countries like China clamping down on the entrepreneur, clamping down on the wealthy. And until 4 or 5 years ago, wealthy people in China could ship money out without any great difficulty. And today, that's a very hard thing to do. They have to keep their money in China. And people like Jack Ma, who was sort of revered as the ultimate and perhaps the greatest entrepreneur in China, if not in the world, was silenced. And a lot of what he does has been curtailed. And I think this is a very worrying trend. I do think that you mentioned cultural issues. I still think there is some significance to them, but going with your theme of things are changing, it used to be in Asia until fairly recently that there was a very rigid system and that daughters did not, for example, inherit business enterprises with a few exceptions, and that there was a very hierarchical system with the eldest son being the sort of anointed crown prince and everybody else kind of having to fend for themselves. And I think that is changing very dramatically all over the world, even including in the Middle East, where this was something that was a fairly rigid rule. And I think it's a trend which has started in the West, but developed very considerably elsewhere as well. And I think it's something that we need to pay attention to.
We mentioned, or I'm going to drill down a little deeper now into challenges that are facing wealthy families. And I'm going to assume in today's world of geopolitical challenges, and you mentioned China, and what I meant in my comment was, of course, Southeast Asia, ex of China. That is a unique situation. But I would say regime change, political, changing the landscape, poor monetary policy, inflation, changing the tax picture, confiscation from the wealth. I suppose maybe none of those things have changed much in 40 years, or have they?
Well, I think they have. And I think you used the word nuance. I like that word. One of the nuances that is of particular interest to me is the fact that China's influence in Southeast Asia, in fact, in all of Asia, is such that many people are now beginning to pay a lot of attention to China, which they weren't doing before. I think Korea and Japan in the north are feeling serious military pressure. I think that there is socioeconomic and military pressure in the south with the Chinese expanding, and with their belt and braces policy, they are doing an awful lot to buy up assets all over the world. And when these assets are not paid for by local communities, the Chinese simply take over the assets. And this is a very big change. And I think that in terms of countries, I think you're very right. Regime change can have dramatic influences on how things work. I think in Thailand, we are seeing the comeback of a dictatorial family which ran the government for a number of years. Now the daughter is in charge. I don't know how far from the tree the apple falls, but I suspect not very far. And I think that there are a lot of other countries all over the world where regime change, particularly in Latin America, will have a dramatic influence on wealth and wealthy families. And I think this is true in Brazil. It's perennially true in Argentina. I think Mexico has had a fairly left-wing president for quite a while. He's about to leave. And all of this is something of a panic button for very wealthy families. And I think one of the results of this is we're seeing a lot more internationalization of families. Families which stayed in a domestic vein are now sending children and creating businesses offshore. The United States is a primary beneficiary of this, but many other countries as well. And you see that the UK was a country which was a great haven for people from former British colonies, and then it expanded into other domains as well. And in the last 6 months, there's been a dramatic change in government in the UK, and all of these people are now having to think seriously about moving themselves and moving their money elsewhere. I worked with a number of Brazilian families that settled forever in the UK, and now all of a sudden, 5 to 10 years later, they've got to think about going somewhere else. And I think flexibility has become a new theme among families and family offices, and being able to react to political change, which is almost lightning-like today, is a very big difference. When you talk about where did we start and where are we today, I think there's a certain irony to that, because where I started when I first began doing this kind of work was a concern in Europe about Russian tanks coming over the German plain and occupying Western Europe. And today, what is one of the big concerns? It's about German tanks coming over the Western European plain and occupying Western Europe. Perhaps that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly the war in Ukraine has caused some very great alarm in Western Europe.
Wow, Joe, you gave me so much there to follow up on because, as my audience knows, this is one of my favorite subjects. Admittingly, a notch or two more applicable for non-U.S. families, but we're going to get to that and weave that in. But everything that you said, completely agree. Brazil.
Well, it's rare that you and I agree on everything, but I feel very strongly about this. And I do think that the United States, which was a haven because of the political environment, is still a haven and has become a new one. Not so much because politics here are stable, and God knows they're not, but it does provide a great big safety net in terms of the economy and in terms of the rules. And the only thing we have to watch out for are things like a potential taxation on capital gains, a potential taxation on unrealized capital gains. I personally think that's a more remote possibility. I don't believe that's going to happen in the next year or two.
All goodies that we're getting into, I've mentioned to my audience for years, they laughed at me. One day, they're going to come after unrealized capital gains. My estimate was, depending on how things politically play out here in the U.S. in the future, AOC or someone like her. But I think if this was boxing, they're giving some punches to the gut to soften the opponent for a point in the future when, sadly, that may become reality. Is the U.S. still in the land of the blind, the one-eyed giant? I would agree. Our rule of law, our military to back it up. Never forget, my audience, that your rule of law, your contracts, none of that matters if you don't have force projection and you don't have military and strength, including that the world is still, for now, settled in dollars. Those are all things that play to the U.S.'s advantage. I completely agree about Brazil, the changes in Argentina, which I could argue short-term look positive, but short-term. Mexico is likely to get even more challenged with the new president coming in. You have major issues in the UK. And like you mentioned about China, and even if you're in Southeast Asia, the threat of China effectively in your backyard, we're going to get to Hong Kong and some other items, perhaps Taiwan and other countries soon. But what you're basically saying is that families need to have optionality, especially non-U.S. families. Are you recommending that they develop networks of influence, banking, business, and passports and residences in multiple countries? What are some of your favorites?
Well, I think it depends what you're talking about. I think one of the changes in England, which I don't think is going to be repeated elsewhere, but, they ceased to be part of the European Union. And I think having a European Union passport is probably good enough at the moment. Some people are very cautionary and want to get other passports. I think Canada is a good one. But these all take time. And unless you're prepared to buy a passport, which I think is an idea which could create as many problems as it solves, I think you have a limited number of choices there. I think economically, people need to say, where am I going to be home for the base of my family office? And Switzerland and Singapore are noteworthy among countries as places where people can set up a family office and feel very safe. I think a lot of people are looking for a safe place to live. New Zealand, but New Zealand is awfully far away. I've flown there many times, and it's a long ride, even in a plane. And I think that people need to give consideration to what is a lifestyle value and how much am I prepared to sacrifice for taxation. I do think setting up family satellites in various countries is a great way to protect yourself, to have your children go live in the U.S., have your children go live in Switzerland, have your children go live in jurisdictions that are very good. Italy has a wonderful tax policy.
Amazing.
Greece was just followed. And these are also good places to send children. How long the Italians, or the Greeks for that matter, are prepared to put up with having rich people favored, we'll see. So far, it's a guarantee for 10 years. But again, this would argue in favor of having a number of places where you have your family located.
Of course, and I've been talking about that for years. Now, we probably don't have the time to get into the challenges of, don't forget, there's way more people that want to come into the U.S. that want to leave. But if they want to come in, depending on how they set up structures, LLCs, Delaware, Wyoming, South Dakota, perhaps a little beyond the scope of today's discussion. And if they want to get green card, then they're going to be subject to U.S. taxation, which were very onerous anywhere around the world. I hear what you're saying about Canada. Great people, beautiful country, lots of natural resources, potential, and a friend to the U.S. I'm sorry, Joe. And maybe I'm wearing my political hat in my sleeve, they're an extremely left-leaning political country. I don't like what they did with the truck drivers. I don't like any threat of confiscation of assets. I would look at as being a little bit more maybe number 5, 6, or 7 down the road. When I mention iconic countries to consider either residency, citizenship, or if you're big enough, the family office, but maybe not you, I think of places like Switzerland. I think of Singapore, and maybe a little bit of an up-and-comer lately, the United Arab Emirates. We all know that Singapore, you have to give up everything, and only that will be your only passport. I'm a little also concerned about proximity to China. Switzerland has been punched a little bit since 2008, including some crises and buckling to the U.S., but I still look at it as favorable, but that's a 10-year process. If you're a non-U.S. citizen, the United Arab Emirates, but then we have the issues happening in the Middle East. No one place is perfect, but if you have a look at those three, and for an international person, the U.S., how would you compare those 3 to 4?
Well, I think let's take them one at a time. Singapore is a fairly rigid and dictatorial regime. I am concerned about China.
Mm-hmm.
I think for the moment, it's a very good place to go. They encourage and attract international families. They very much want family offices to set up a family office or a satellite family office there. The tax regime is very favorable, but it is figuratively on China's doorstep, and that is of concern to me. Now, Switzerland, I think, is a very good place to be. They have a somewhat complex tax regime. You can get a tax forfait, as they call it,
Mm-hmm.
which is a set, predetermined amount of tax you pay, but it doesn't give you access to the Swiss treaty network unless you pay local income tax. Now, I'm going through a very interesting process right now where we're moving somebody from the UK to Switzerland. And what we are doing is limiting the amount of income that this person will have The rest will go into a family irrevocable trust in which he will not be a beneficiary. But if he gives himself $1 million to live on per year, and he's prepared to pay the Swiss 30% tax on that, it can be a wonderful way to go because you don't pay the forfait. You do have the benefit of the Swiss tax treaties, and you can run your business from Switzerland, which you can't do if you are on a forfait. So this is an option that I'm beginning to look at much more closely.
I agree.
And, then we're left with other countries. I'm not saying live in Canada. I'm saying getting a passport there. And I'll sidestep all of your criticisms of the country, which I tend to agree with. But, I think it is, it's also cold. And I think it's a place that is attractive. You have offshore islands like Bermuda or the Bahamas where people can live very comfortably and there's no tax. They are in close proximity to the United States. I think the UAE is an interesting question. I wrote the trust law in Dubai. And I have a couple of issues with the jurisdictions. I think they're very good. I think they're very receptive to wealthy people. They have no population to speak out. The native population is approximately 10% of the population in Dubai. And that can lead to some fairly rapid political extremism because you don't need a lot of voices to start shouting very loudly in the local assembly. And I think they are very strict Muslim countries. And while there are certain bypasses for foreign settlers, don't get caught drunk driving.
And Joe, should I be concerned? And I think it's beautiful. It's modern. There's so much to be positive about. If I'm a non-U.S. citizen, I have incredible tax advantages and fluidity. But somewhere in the back of my head, maybe because I'm an extreme person who values personal liberties and freedom, it is a kingdom. And kings could change the rules rather easily, can't they?
Well, it's not a kingdom. It's 7 different emirates. And the emir is effectively a king, you're right. And they can change the rules very quickly. For the moment, the trend is to liberalize, and they're even experimenting with gambling in Ras Al Khaimah, which is one of the emirates, with a view to having that come to Dubai, which is really the sort of go-go cultural center. And I think it's a very good place to be. I've set up a couple of offices there, but there is certain tradition and rigidity in the system, which isn't apparent on the surface, but it's very much there. And I think these are things that people need to examine closely before they make a major commitment. For example, the purchase of land is sort of free in Dubai, but in other emirates, it is not.
Yes.
And, the emirate right next to Dubai, which is Sharjah, is very, very conservative, and there's no drinking at all in Sharjah. So I'm not saying drinking is a panacea. I'm just saying that this is a cultural value, and in Dubai, they've decided to shut a blind eye for foreigners who come in, but don't wear a skimpy bikini bathing suit on the beach in Dubai. And public pools.
And I'm in trouble, Joe. I ain't going.
Well, I do think that people need to look at some of the offshore islands. I think that, they have some real attraction to them. Places like Monaco have some interest. There are little enclaves in Europe like San Marino. But you got to seriously want to go live in the mountains to go to some of those places.
Of course. And you mentioned one, I'm not just saying it because my first name is Angelo, that is gravely underrated relative to some political changes they made, their tax holiday, and that is Italy. Incredible culture, great food, great people. And because my audience knows, although I've been very critical of much of Europe, I do hold Switzerland to a high regard as a global epicenter of wealth. And there's a reason why many of the world's billionaires have certain businesses, resources, or at minimal, their satellite family offices there. Northern Italy specifically gives me the more immediate benefits of Italy, which are easier to achieve, and the tax benefits. Yet, if things were to get bad, I could drive and get to Switzerland very easy. I look at that as being an interesting 1-2 combo, especially if I establish existing business interest in Switzerland.
Well, again, I think you're absolutely right, but I would caution people that if they are setting up businesses in Switzerland and it has got a very good treaty network, they have to be very careful not to live there. And if they are going to live there, they've got a plan to move their business interests outside, which may be no more complicated than setting up a holding company in the Channel Islands or somewhere else. And I think there are a number of jurisdictions which have favorable tax regimes, although they still charge tax. Those would include the Channel Islands and places like Malta, where you can go. But again, islands are islands, and after a while you get a little cabin fever and you may want to get out. I think one other place to mention, which is of great interest to me, but it's a temptation that has to be looked at with a certain amount of care, and that is Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which have effectively a 4% tax for entrepreneurs. And the real problem there is that a lot of people think that when they get favorable advice, they only listen to the favorable part, not the unfavorable part. And the rule in both of those places is that you've got to be there more than 182 days a year. And the only person that's really watching you as to whether or not you're there is the IRS. So if you're a Belgian and you live there for 80 days a year, it's great. But if you are an American, it can be a real problem. Now, one thing for foreigners is they can get a U.S. passport in Puerto Rico if they live there long enough, 5 years. And there's no estate tax, there's no capital gains tax, so it's an attractive proposition. And there's a different regime in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but it's virtually the same.
Correct. And boy, Joe, you're really going on Angelo's cultural heritage today. I'm half Italian, half Puerto Rican. So been to Puerto Rico many times, did a million events there, pretty connected there. And for an American citizen relative to the tax aspect, that probably is potentially number one. I think what you're getting to as a challenge could be island fever, the challenges of the time you may have to spend there depending on your business interest. And let's be rather blunt. A spouse interest and children and schooling are also issues that potentially are going to be a problem. We didn't mention yet, I mean, I mentioned it, but we didn't go overly into it. For an international person, the opportunity of coming here to the traditional states of the United States and coming under our auspice of green card into potentially citizenship, and the IRS then following you everywhere around the world. But are you willing to trade that for a level of security that you perceive? It may get worse as the decades progress, but for now, these are all things that I'm assuming you help your international clients look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of the core 4 to 5 options that we noted.
Well, the U.S., I think, is perhaps the greatest tax haven of all.
Of course.
But again, you have to watch the downside. And the downside is a hammer that could end up sending you to jail. It hasn't so far as I know, but if you end up in civil litigation with the IRS, that's not a good thing. And I think that the U.S. is a tax haven because you can set up a trust before you come into the U.S. that remains offshore and is not taxed in the United States. Now, if you do it less than 5 years before you come in, the income in that trust is going to be subject to tax in the United States as though it were a grantor trust. There are, however, a number of things that you can do to eliminate or significantly reduce the profile of your tax status. And such things would include the use of private placement life insurance and basing all of your assets and borrowing money, which will narrow the profile of the value of the equity of the asset you hold. So there are a lot of steps that can be taken, but it'll take 6 months or a year to get this plan right. But the U.S., for many people, has proved to be a great tax haven. And you talk about the green card. To me, that is one subject I don't want to deal with because I don't like green cards. And there are other visas that can be acquired, which will give you the right to remain in the United States for very long periods of time. And we talked about passports, and one of the passports that may be of interest is in Grenada in the Caribbean, because there they have a treaty with the United States that allows you to get an E1 or an E2 visa, which allows you to own a business and remain in the United States for as long as you like. Now, you still have the residency issue, and that basically says you can't be in the U.S. for more than 182 days a year, or in some cases, 120 days a year, without being subject to U.S. income tax on your worldwide income. But if you don't need to be here more than that, it's an easy problem to avoid, and it's done on a year-by-year basis. So if you are out for 2 years and then decide you want to be in for 1, you can do that. Now, the other issue, which I think is a little sensitive, and this is particularly true for a lot of foreigners that look on the U.S. as a haven, particularly those from Asia, and that is that state taxes are something that people need to pay attention to. And I mentioned the 120 and the 182-day rules. State of California doesn't believe in those. It will apply its own standard to a foreigner living in the United States. So he can say, well, I've been in the United States for 119 days, or in the other way, 180 days, and I'm fine because I've followed the U.S. guidelines. Well, California doesn't believe in that, and they may very well come after you. And if they do, you're looking at potentially 10 years of litigation and an awful lot of sleepless nights. So I think state law is something people need to pay attention to.
Yes, why anyone other than the beauty of the state would want to choose that for business or residence, I don't quite get it. Just go visit. I could also mention, unless things change, for an international non-U.S. citizen, you mentioned the U.S. being a great tax haven. We don't report, Joe, to that blocked entity of other countries that shockingly even the Swiss report to. Is there talk about that changing? And is that why the U.S. is a great quote-unquote tax haven for international non-U.S. citizens?
Well, I'm talking about people who actually spend a lot of time here. But yes, I think the common reporting standard,
yes,
we have FATCA. And right after FATCA was introduced, it took about 4 years to get FATCA up and running. And in 2014, right after FATCA came into force, they developed something called GATCA, which was global FATCA. And that is now the common reporting standard. And its really serious ramification is that, except for the United States, the Dominican Republic, and 1 or 2 other countries, every country in the world, 105 countries have now signed up to this. And they provide for automatic exchange of financial information. It's not just tax information. It's if you have a bank account, if you have an investment account in country X and you live in country Y, country X will report to country Y. And by having a structure set up in the United States, in Delaware, in Wyoming, in Nevada, in Tennessee, there are about 10 different states that have special laws to attract foreigners. You can avoid the common reporting standard. I think people are a little leery that in violating CRS, they may be creating some problems. And I think over time that could become an issue, but for the moment it is not. I don't use onshore trusts for people who have no nexus with the United States. But if they have a visa and come here, if they have children in school here, if they own businesses or property here, then I don't have a great difficulty in setting up a domestic trust for foreign individuals. And they're very knowledgeable lawyers and trustees in these states that look to this as a major source of business. I'm going to be speaking in Wyoming in a couple of weeks about some of the issues involving some of the foreign laws which are of relevance.
Excellent. One of my part-time states where I live and have my business interests, so I do love Wyoming. How about a country that doesn't get talked about, I believe, enough? Uruguay. And there might even be other countries, Chile, but probably more specifically Uruguay. Any opinion?
Well, I think Uruguay is a great country for financial affairs. It has become difficult for some private banks to do business in places like Argentina. So you get in the rowboat, you go across the River Plate, and you set up in Montevideo. And, I think we've talked about Mexico, we've talked about Brazil, Peru, Chile. These are all volatile countries. And I think Uruguay has a real place for Latin Americans. And I think it's a fascinating little country. It's a great place to buy very old cars, probably next to Cuba, the best in the world. And it's also an interesting place because if you go to, what's the name of the town on the beach?
Yes.
There are thousands of apartments in these blocks. And if you go there in the summer, their time.
Right. Our winter in North America.
Yeah. Except for Christmas and one or two other times, you go and look at these buildings and they're just dark at night. There are no lights on. Nobody lives in them. They're there strictly when they need to be. And it's quite interesting. They probably claim residence in these places in Uruguay and spend 3 weeks a year there. So I think it's a good country.
I agree. And maybe going back to the original question that led to this on regime change and kind of geopolitical and what's going on in the world. Now, we could argue, having been around the block since the days of OPEC in the mid-'70s, interest rate crisis, a variety of different challenges. There's always been challenges, but it does seem more volatile than ever before. We have, although not global, 2 wars going on. Russia's been obviously a major challenge. We are no longer, like it might have been in the 70s and 80s back in our heyday, Joe, a unipolar world where the U.S. dominated everything. Things are changing. I would argue may not even be bipolar. It may be multi now. Obviously, the U.S., China, but I could argue other countries and blocks as well. We see the rise of the BRICS. We see the incredible rise the last couple of years of AI and potentially one day the impact of super intelligent AI, robotics, drones, new warfare, space wars. We're in a dangerous world. And I get it. I could have said that 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. It seems worse in some ways now. What are ways that families could do besides passports, although that's a pretty good one, and diverse global interests to hedge against risk?
Well, I think I agree with you. I think the risks are much more, if not much worse, I think they're much more immediate because things happen at a much, much faster pace today than they did even 30 years ago. And I think that a lot of families have to be very sensitive to cyber attacks, to making sure their data is absolutely secure, to developing private networks. I'm not a specialist, but I find cryptocurrency to be very interesting to me. I don't know how or what people as families can do to hedge certain economic risks by use of cryptocurrency. I'm not sure anybody does know at this point, but in the next 4 or 5 years, I think that's something that's going to come to the fore. I think technology, as you mentioned, AI, is going to greatly change how people think. I think the greatest threat at the moment is that the governments are beginning to use a lot of this technology specifically to go after families. And I think this is something that families need to protect against. And I'm not suggesting, as you might, that a barter economy is the way to go. But I do think that people need to be very much aware. And I think a very good example of this, talking about cultural impetus, and you mentioned wealth in Asia. I had a client a few years ago who was in a Southeast Asian country, and he called me all excited one day and said, "I've just been nominated for the Forbes 400 Asia list." And I said, "Oh, no, you don't want to do that.
Yeah, you're a target.
You're a big target, and you might as well paint it on your front and back." And he said, "Well, okay, that makes some sense to me." And 2 weeks later, he called me and he said, "Well, I'm on the Forbes list." And I said, "And you're proud of that?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I'm very proud, but I followed your advice." I said, "How?" And he said, "Well, I only told him I was worth 1.8 billion rather than the 10 billion I'm worth." So, different strokes for different folks. I think that one of the issues that I confront a lot is we're dealing with very well-educated people. And I call this the dialogue of the deaf. And people may speak a language I speak as fluently or better than I do, but the thought process can be very, very different. And sometimes people, families, generations do not communicate in the same way. And this is a very important thing. I like to go with people and say, okay, let's go back and make sure we understand each other. And it used to, going back to the very first things you were saying, it used to be that you'd get families who would say, "I don't want my children to know I'm rich." And I'd sit there and I'd look at them for a moment and I said, "You mean you live in a $20 million house and you think your children don't know how rich they are?" I said, this is just sophistry. And you have to think about how generations react slightly differently. And I find the younger generations tend to be much more interested in ecology, much more interested in saving the planet, much more interested in socially responsible investing. And you wonder to what extent this is going to become a trend that is going to become universal. And if they all go to the same schools and they all learn the same things, maybe this is something that when they go back home, the diaspora of education is going to have some effect. There are a number of things about where we're headed that I find fascinating, and I think this is a great world to be in. And I think working with families is one of the most interesting spaces to be because they are interested in preservation, but the preservation of what is sometimes a little more complex than it first appears.
Well, since you brought up some subjects, I will circle it back to, and I know my friends in Europe are going to think that I keep on hitting upon them, even though, again, incredible people, great architecture, great food, partial cultural heritage from my perspective and many of us here in America, and just wonderful. And I enjoy being there, and my trips to Central Europe have been nothing but a joy. But you feel the buck coming up, Joe. And I've spoken about this in debates and others on my podcast. I see grave concerns over Europe. They don't broadly have the natural resources and energy independence that we do, or at least could have here in the U.S. There's a variety of challenges, in my opinion, with incredible amounts of bureaucracy. Again, you have multiple countries and about the size of the U.S. There's going to be things that are going on. In my opinion, I don't mean to overly bring politics into it, but you have generally what they deem to be very egalitarian, very left-leaning, not only equal opportunity, but equal outcomes. And then you have hierarchy, bureaucracy, taxation. You have the issues with a lack of what I deem to be often the real entrepreneurial spirit and the advantages that we look to being quote unquote, let's grind it, let's work hard. It's different and it's really enjoyable. Again, I love Europe. I'm just saying, and I didn't even get into the issues of their demographics are woeful. They have massive issues, a word that I'll use in immigration. I see problem after problem after problem. Joe, correct me. Where am I looking at this wrong? Or I'm 90% correct.
I'd say you're 88.5% correct.
I'll take it.
I think you pointed to a number of issues that need to be, I think, looked at. I think there has been a very great swing to the left, but the reaction has been, for me, equally alarming. And that is very right-wing governments in places like Hungary and Italy. And we just saw this weekend in Germany that 2 states elected very far right-wing assemblies. So this is a reaction that people need to pay some attention to. And I think that France is politically in chaos. They're in dead neutral.
Completely.
They can't get out of their own way. Belgium had a year and a half where everything functioned very, very well because they had no government at all. These are serious problems. Immigration is a very serious problem. And I think the other problem, which you alluded to, but which is very fundamental, is the whole concept of forced heirship, where under the Napoleonic Code, which is the law in virtually every country in Europe except Ireland, if you exclude the UK, and maybe Malta or 1 or 2 others, which says essentially that when somebody dies, all of their property will go equally to all of their children, which makes it very, very difficult for a family enterprise to continue as it had been during the life of the pater or mater familias. And this is a very serious problem in a lot of European countries, and a number of them, including Switzerland. You can elect out of it, but you need all the children to agree. And to get all the children to agree, you better do it before they have any sort of power of their own, because they may not want to give it up so easily. In France, you can't do that. In France, it does get divided. So you have to work out some sort of voting trust or voting pact so that the family will continue to vote in a predetermined form. But they are imperfect, and anything which violates the forced heirship rules in France and in several other European countries is ultra vires. It's something which you cannot do. So if you do sign such a pact and 5 years later one of the children revolts, you can get the whole thing thrown out. So I think it's a very serious cultural issue that impacts families and impacts family businesses very considerably. I know one German family that owned a lot of assets in Germany and Switzerland, and they ended up giving it all to charity, a charity they created, and then they went on the board and they paid themselves fairly handsome salaries, but they don't own the equity anymore. So,
yeah. Again, more than we're going to solve in the 10 minutes that we talk about it, but I think these are fair points to bring up that honestly, I just don't see other people talking about, either from a level of ignorance, in my opinion, or simply they're uncomfortable with uncomfortable conversations, which you need to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. I don't care about political correctness. And I'm wrong. I'm not saying I'm always right. I'm just saying these are things that we need to more openly discuss in our community. And they appear to be a sensitive football for those that are overly politically correct. Even if they might have good information that I can learn from and share, they're simply afraid to, especially in a more public forum. Let's go back to Asia, so a little bit around the world again. And one area that we didn't mention that you're pretty fluid in, what's going on with Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong, to me, is now integrated into China. I mean, there are a few little vestiges of not only the former regime, but the treaty which said that Hong Kong wouldn't change for 50 years. But, for example, all of the English judges that had been in Hong Kong as lifers have resigned. The judiciary is now 100% in the hands of the Chinese. I think economically, while there is certain freedom from things like currency exchange and what have you, it's sort of lip service, and the people who are pro-Chinese are tending to be much more favored than those who aren't. And if you're seriously anti-Chinese, you go to jail. And you go to jail with some frequency. You don't get shipped up to China, but you go to jail in Hong Kong. I'm not sure that one is materially better than the other, but I don't think I would want to make that Hobson's choice.
And maybe it's a little off target relative to a family office conversation, but what do you think about the interplay and what could happen with China and Taiwan?
Well, that I think is a much scarier proposition because it's an all or nothing one. China will either invade with a view to taking over Taiwan, at which point we will be on the brink of World War III, or they won't. And they will keep saber rattling, but by saber rattling, their influence in theory will increase, because if they say, look, I'm asking to bite your head off, but if you agree to what I want to do, I'm only going to take your hand. Again, Hobson's choice, but if you only have two, you give up the hand.
And maybe I'm looking at it too much from an American perspective, but going back to the issue of the US dollar hegemony, going back to BRICS, going back to we have enemies and dangerous forces that at least we perceive here in the world, it seems like now that it's more of a multipolar world, that some that we would call rivals to democracy in the true sense, China, potentially now teaming up more, including with BRICS, with quote unquote, with Russia, with Iran, who has a lot of smart people and has resources, potentially now with North Korea that has a significant military. Actually, every country that I just noted would probably be among the top 5 to 6, 7 militaries in the world. So this is a dangerous world. When I look at military of NATO, yeah, the U.S., of course, is, well, maybe a little woke in certain ways for my taste, but let's call it powerful. But the UK is a shell of what their Navy used to be. Poland is still pretty good. Turkey technically is a part of NATO. I would say they're strong, but depending on how things tip in the Middle East, I could see them going in a different direction. The world is a powder keg, Joe. I don't know how I sleep at night. Somehow I sleep really well.
Well, I think you failed to mention one country which is sort of quiet at the moment, but quiescent, I think, would be a better word for it.
India?
India.
Yeah, of course.
Which has an enormous army, and they're ready to, the wonderful peace-loving Indians are very happy to go to war with Pakistan at almost the drop of a hat.
Of course.
And, these are huge populations. China, I think, has surrendered the largest population in the world to India. And India has got, obviously, tremendous rich and poor problems. And there is a hegemony of wealthy families who I think are living somewhat precariously. And if they were to get, loud, and I think your point on Turkey is equally true in India, that this could go either way. And, they are a nuclear power. They have a huge army. And while it's not as sophisticated as the U.S. Army, it certainly poses a huge danger to a lot of South Asia.
Indeed. Wow. Lots of problems there, Joe. And you mentioned one of the strategies earlier, and again, we're going round robin on a lot of different topics, maybe not doing a super deep dive into any one, but especially for non-U.S. families, but some of these absolutely for U.S. families as well, what I would define as tax mitigation strategies. Things like owning and structuring captive insurers, reinsurers, and you mentioned for those with active, very taxable, effectively alt portfolios, consideration for creative utilization of private placement life insurance. And again, we could spend hours just on this topic, but if you had to give a brief summary in how they intertwine, globally for the super rich? Please.
Well, I think that, these are, again, the good news is great news, but there is a downside, and people have to be aware of this. They're pretty easy to get around, but you have to do it in order to qualify. And the United States, for example, has a life insurance program, and you can have your policy written anywhere in the world if you want to, as long as it complies with the U.S. tax rules under Section 7702 of the Internal Revenue Code. And we use a lot of these strategies, and I think the one we use most often is simply lending, because you can reduce the value of equity by a very considerable margin if you lend against the property. And, sometimes you can use your own lending company, sometimes you have to go outside. Captive insurance is also a very attractive option by which people can preserve wealth. And something like owning a reinsurance company or owning a piece of a reinsurance company, this is a wonderful way to make sure that the wealth you do accumulate is untaxed. And the way that works is very simple, and that is that reinsurance companies and indeed captive insurance companies may retain very large sums of money as reserves against potential losses. And while they are reserves and are admitted as such, they're not going to be taxed. So they can build up a lot of money. The issue is, what do you do when you reach the end of the term? And if you come from a tax-free country, that's easy. If you come from a high-tax country, you have to work to come up with some other strategies to make sure that you don't get hit with a huge dividend tax when you pay it out.
And Joe, I think I'm coming to my final three questions. Let me take a scenario that I don't think, and more so for the estate tax here in the U.S., that many very wealthy families think about, of course, until it's too late. I'll give a scenario. A 75-year-old billionaire that has 50, 60, 70% of their portfolio in private equity. They have no control. It's tied up. And now, assuming they don't have a spouse because they got divorced or simply they're single or widowed, and the opportunity happens, well, they die, especially without preparation leading into it. Where are they going to have the money to address a significant estate tax bill, which likely in a couple of years will bump up and get even higher and higher? And with the deficit and other challenges we have, likely taxes, quote unquote, won't be coming down. Why isn't this scenario spoken about enough? And what are some options that could address liquidity needs?
The answer to your first question is, I don't know why. This is a topic, again, this is the dialogue of the deaf.
Yes.
People here in the United States assume you know about estate tax. So when they meet with a foreign client, they assume that he knows what is going to happen. And that to me is a suicide. And the foreign client is dumb and happy. He doesn't know any better. And I think that when you have a cross-border situation, it is vital to think outside the box and make sure that you're not only thinking about the rules in your country, but thinking about the rules in the other country as well. And that's particularly true for the United States. And one of the things I would think about is seeing whether you can't decontrol these subjects and make sure that your assets are foreign owned to avoid estate tax. And sometimes there are structures you can use that are very simple that will solve this, such as using a BVI company. Now, let's go to the example you gave. If everything is owned by a BVI company and you have a locked up private equity fund where you can't get at it until probably after you're dead, then the use of a foreign corporation is perhaps a great solution.
Mm-hmm.
However, if the same investment portfolio is invested in hedge funds, which are taxed on a mark-to-market basis, you got a big problem on your hands. So again, there are no magic solutions. Everything has to be looked at in and of itself, but very often there are solutions. And people need to say, okay, here are all my wares. They're out on the carpet. What do I do with them? And that's when you have to make up your mind before you set up your structure.
Indeed. And yes, I did pull that question kind of out of my butt. I thought that was a good one that is not being asked enough in the community. Again, not just the surface level, think deeper.
Well, I guess my job is to point out in an interview the kinds of areas where you got problems. And then it's your job to have people come and see me if they want to solve them.
And you would be the man. 2 final questions. One, I have multiple relationships in Canada, even though sometimes I talk some crap about the country, but great people, beautiful. I actually kind of like the cold and enjoy it. I think it's a lot of fun. But this is a relationship, a member of mine that looks at the United States very favorably for a variety of the reasons that we spoke about, some of the strengths of the U.S., and is looking at buying significant property in the West, enjoys the American West, and looking to be more active. Now, we touched on it in the last question and earlier when it came to green cards and visas, but they may want to know, like, I don't know, I'm talking from their perspective, if I'm ready to give up, renounce my Canadian citizenship and look to become a U.S. citizen, whatever, South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, wherever one of those ranch lands may be. And maybe initially, until that happens, you do own it through a Cayman Island structure. What broad advice or recommendations would you give my Canadian friend, a wealthy family, on make sure you think things through and plan? What are some questions they should be asking?
What are they buying? Are they buying property that is going to be profit-making?
Oh,
because you have
farm or ranch land. So yes.
I mean, you have to, if you are doing something that is going to be earning a profit, maybe what you want to think about is, and if you're not going to be making a profit, then the answer is simple. You put it in a structure which keeps you away from U.S. estate tax until you come into the United States. Passport, they'll never have to give up their Canadian passport, certainly not to come to the U.S. And eventually, if they wanted to, they could even have both a U.S. and a Canadian passport. I have a friend in Dubai who was both Canadian and U.S., gave up the U.S. passport for tax reasons, but has kept the Canadian one. But I would look to see if they are going to be earning income in the property, how can we minimize the income on a balance sheet without reducing the profit? And there are things like borrowing against the property, which are very effective, and it maybe you can use your own lending company to do that, but the interest, of course, would be tax deductible. The value of the property would be reduced by the size of a mortgage, for example. You could also take some of the profit and allocate it to improvements. There are a number of things that can be done to reduce the amount of tax. It may be that some of the livestock could be invested in a way that's tax efficient. So this is something you want to review when you get closer to coming in. And again, you would end up with a state tax. I don't know for sure, but I would suspect in Montana or Nebraska, but you wouldn't in Wyoming. So that may be a consideration. People say, well, state tax, how much can it be? Well, the answer is that in California, it's 13.3%, and the federal tax will not deduct anything for state tax paid. So that's an additional 13.3% you will pay. And there is talk in some circles in California of raising it to 17%. So California has to be a dream unless you're really, really prepared to take some steps to avoid serious taxation.
Indeed. And my final question, Joe, for those out there that admire you from afar, that see your incredible career, I do occasionally want to ask a question for those that are advisors or counselors in the community. Maybe I could picture a young attorney that's like, wow, I want to be like this guy Field. I want to travel the world, work with billionaires, do these amazing things. What recommendations would you have for someone that would, to some degree, like to follow in the footsteps that you've enjoyed in your career?
Well, I think you want to get a job with a firm that has international capability. There are a number of very good firms in this country that don't, but there are a number of very good firms in this country that do. I think you want to think about starting with one region where you might have a particular interest, where you can study the culture, you can study the economies of the various countries in the region. If you're a Spanish speaker, if you've grown up in Florida, or you have an affinity to Spanish language, Latin America would be a very easy choice. But Spain is also a place where people look to, and Portugal is another place aside from Brazil where, language capability would be very useful. I think anywhere in Europe, being able to speak French or German would be very helpful. Asia is a little more of a challenge. If you're not a native speaker, learning Mandarin, which I think would be the only language worth learning from scratch, is very, very difficult. Korean is also difficult. And again, having a cultural affinity is a very, very good thing. Again, I love to tell stories. And one of the stories that was a fascination to me is I interviewed a young culturally Korean lawyer. Her parents were both Korean. She was a first-generation American. And I said, well, we'd love to, consider sending you to Hong Kong because you have this Korean affinity and you speak the language. And she said, wait a minute, I don't speak the language. And what has happened in a number of Latin families is that children don't learn English because they can vote, they can get driver's licenses, they can work just speaking Spanish. And that's particularly true in places like Florida. For Asian families, quite the contrary is true. They want to assimilate as quickly as possible. So people that don't speak English at all will try and speak English with their children just to make sure that they assimilate as Americans as fast as they can. And in some cases, you end up with a Korean cultural lawyer who doesn't speak 2 words of Korean. Fascinating.
Very much so. Joe, what can I say? This is flown by. Many questions left on the table for next time. For those that really enjoyed our conversation, would like to learn more about you and connect, how could they do so?
Very simple. Just send me an email. My email is brondofield, B like boy, ROND like dog, OFIELD, @gmail.com.
Excellent, everyone. This has been Joe Field. In worst case, if that doesn't work, but that was pretty straightforward. I've known Joe forever. Would be happy to make a connection. Simply just let me know. And again, this was really an honor. Back in my old audio-only podcast days, I had Joe on once or twice, probably 7 or 8 years ago. But this is the first time in my more modern format. We figured out the technology. It's all good. I've looked up to this guy for so long. And randomly, after reaching out to Joe for the first time, probably since COVID, literally magic was in the air. I'm walking the streets in New York about a month ago, summer in 2024, and I happened to bump into Joe, which was so awesome. And we kind of planned this and this date effectively on the spot, and I look forward to many more. You're all learning about many of my kind of superheroes in the community and those that I call, and I'm lucky to call, part of my dream team that I've learned so much from. And without question, Joe Field is definitively one of them. In my close, besides the fact that it was an incredible honor and I'm humbled to have Joe on and learn so much from him, I'm Angelo Robles. You can learn more about joining and being a part that is intimate, that is non-public, including face-to-face interactions with people like Joe, because I'm doing so many programs for my members in New York. Go to angelorobles.com, learn about all that I do, but including joining my membership club at SFO Continuity and being one of 30 special founding members with opportunity to proprietary content and multiple New York, Florida, occasionally Wyoming and California and Central Europe Yes, I didn't forget about you all, programs that I host live. From soirees to cigar functions. I do like my cigars. I got to invite Joe to one of them if he smokes. We'll see. To my breakfast. Come on, Joe. Every now and then, you don't have to tell the wife. It's okay.
No, I do smoke cigars, but I'm very limited in what I smoke, and I enjoy it greatly, but not at breakfast.
Yeah, that might be a little early in the day, but it's 5 o'clock somewhere, so we could kind of figure that out.
That's right. And I want to return the compliment and say I have very much enjoyed this. I have, Angelo is no shrinking violet. He put on a number of programs that I've attended, and in spite of his reactionary political views, he's brought to my attention a number of the most liberal things I've ever seen. And he even put on a program once for people promoting the legalization of marijuana, which I found to be something of a surprise, but it was very interesting nonetheless. And Angelo's contacts involved some of the most interesting and intelligent financial managers in the world, and I've met a number of them through Angelo, and I support you 100% and would be very interested in getting involved in your community.
You're very kind. It's an honor to have you there. And yes, being more of a libertarian on things like what you just described, I am actually not a surprise to fellow libertarian types. I believe Joe was in Martha's Vineyard with his lovely wife when I had, leading into the election in 2016, so it had to be late August of 2016, I had Newt Gingrich, and he come and spoke. And he told the audience how it was going to play out. And I would say 80% of the audience effectively laughed at him relative to the 2016 election. He ended up being very, very correct, obviously. You all could also follow me on some new platforms on Rumble. Don't forget my two on YouTube, at Family Office and at Family Office TV. And I'm back, beginning to be more active on Apple and on Spotify for those of you that like traditional audio or like to drive a lot, and it simply is an easier platform. I appreciate all of you. Joe, thank you so much for your kind words. Go to
great.com. A great pleasure.
And reach out to Joe, please. And if you lost track of that contact info, just reach out to me. But maybe on that note, Joe, if you could read off your email one more time.
BRONDFIELD@gmail.com.
That does it for me. Joe, thank you so much. Tell the wife I said hello and look forward to seeing you this fall.
Thank you, Angelo. I very much enjoyed this.
My honor. Thank you.